I think we'll get started. So we've been talking a lot about data today, who owns it, privacy around data, but how about what can we do with it? What can we use? What problems can we solve? So our next panel will talk about just that, solving social contextual big data problems. And I want to introduce Peter Berger from People Plus, Jeff Stevens, ContextualM, and Tyler Bell from Factual.
Oh, TikTok.
Yep, exactly. Guy in the middle.
No, it's just a clock.
Oh, cool. We have a little clock down there. So, hi, my name is Peter Berger. I am the CEO and co-founder of People Plus. People Plus is a next-generation business information company designed for the wearable and mobile world. Instead of having these gigantic static web pages about business information, what we're doing is trying to provide both businesses and individuals with the ability to see the interconnection between people, companies, and roles. This is not just simply for internal management for companies, but also the ability to look outside your organization for better sales, better business development, as well as better recruiting.
Hey, so my name is Jeff Stevens. I'm with ContextM, and contrary to what it says, I'm not the moderator, just as a panelist here. And what ContextM does is it helps its clients in the mobile space reduce the noise, the WTF moments that we see when we look at our phones, and we wonder why that was just put there. And we do it by creating a micro-segmentation of customers using your social sphere, what you put up on Facebook and elsewhere, to understand how you interact with others and what things are of interest to you.
Hey folks, my name is Tyler Bell. I'm from Factual. We enrich location data.
Cool.
All right.
So so we were talking before we got up on stage about the best ways to address the topic of context, particularly context with wearables in business. And I think that the question we all came up with was, what is context, and how do you really define it? Since I went first, I guess I'll just sort of pass off to Tyler.
Go for it.
I will take the conch. Thank you, Pete. One of the most fascinating trends that we've seen over the last, let's say, 3 years is the removal of or the movement of from a third-person experience to a first-person experience. So if you take mapping, for example, it's moving from that top-down view of mapping to one where it's much more immersive, like a street view type environment. And so you see that in map, and you see it in mapping tech, but generally it's a pretty comfortable paradigm that individual computing is becoming much more about us, about the individual. And so you hear the idea of personalization being batted around. Really my general sort of broad umbrella overview of what context entails is it's really the mechanism that allows us being developers or app publishers. Context is a mechanism, one of many, that allows us to personalize how your mobile device, how your individual wearable device engages with you. It basically brings the computing experience from that top-down view, where you're one of many, to the first-person view, where everything now pivots on the individual rather than on the large bulk audience.
And I'll pick up from where Tyler just left off. So location is what we've been using for some time for context. Sometimes it's better than others. What we work on at ContextM is trying, as I mentioned earlier, to micro-segment the customer so that we try to understand at a location, what persona are you in? Are you in a work persona, a play persona, a family persona, a religious persona? Because you could be in a different persona in the same location as other people that are there for a very different reason. So today, location often is the strongest form of context that's available, but I think that over the next few years, we're going to see more and more looking at the individuals, just as Tyler was saying. That's where it's headed. So that's how I view context.
I mean, the easiest way to talk about context for People Plus is we fundamentally don't care where the data comes from. What we fundamentally care about is how that data is applied to the information about the individual. It looks like Tyler was saying, so that if you're looking at location data, it can be extremely important, particularly in a business setting when you're talking about where you are on a particular campus. Are you at lunch or are you actually in the meeting room? But also looking at contextual awareness between pieces of devices, both wearable and mobile. Our devices are talking to each other now. They're talking to each other and saying, hi, I'm the device. They're talking to each other and passing information back and forth pursuant to low energy Bluetooth protocols. And so we at People Plus are essentially providing methodologies as well as data itself for businesses to be able to not only take that sort of people information, but then start storing and understanding and using effectively the information between between individuals in a workplace, but also between individuals and a sort of a deal-making or an opportunity standpoint.
And there are many different ways that you can use context. Two of the ways that I like to think about it is either information delivery or in experience enrichment. So Disney recently just announced they're spending $1 billion on their Magic Band. And that's all about enriching the experience. There's no smartphone app that they're using. Well, there is for a little part of it for the planning. But it's all about them, the park, knowing where you are, who you are, and making it so that your debit and credit card is on that wristband as well. So, and for those who don't know, the Magic Band actually has 3 separate devices on it. It's got 2 different RFID and what we call ISM, so a 2.4 gigahertz radio. And so among the things that they're doing, it used to be at Disney that in trying to enrich your experience, they would look and see what the density of people were in a certain area of the park, and if there were too many people, the line for too long, they'd have a row of characters that would block off that part of the park. Now they're using technology to look at the density of those wristbands in that area, just parabolic dishes. So technology is really enhancing how we can understand the context of the people in the park and enrich their experience as well.
I'd be keen to hear from my fellow panelists here about a use case or a business case where your company helps enrich context or solves a particularly egregious problem.
Well, so for People Plus, one of the things we worked on really early on both a mobile and a wearable context, and you can sort of see it from a lot of our early demonstration videos, is how do you understand who you're going to be connecting with inside a physical environment? So sometimes you can use location data to triangulate. So that means, hi, my device recognizes I'm in a particular place via my GPS, and then it sort of sends off to the cloud and says, okay, who based on other people's GPS is in the same place, and sort of reaches back and forth. However, that's prone to a lot of shortcomings because you have to be able to connect. How's everybody's internet down here if you're not connected to the Wi-Fi? Not particularly good. However, our devices are getting smart enough to talk to each other. And so what we did as an early test bed is use low energy Bluetooth to have devices communicate to each other. They hand back little bits of information, sort of saying, hi, I am this device, who are you? And then these very finite pieces of information that can be very informative, but are still very secure. And so we use low energy Bluetooth to have devices talk to each other and help people identify each other in a real world context. We debuted that technology at South by Southwest. We had a lot of really good feedback. One of the largest challenges is in a consumer context, using that is problematic because you have to rely on the device manufacturers to be able to build a stack that is going to help you with low energy Bluetooth. The device manufacturers are still evolving in that space, and that's why people are building their own beacons. But I think in a business context, like Jeff was pointing out, it can be very, very powerful to be able to provide context with or without location.
So the first example that comes to mind for me, imagine you're going to a hospitality company's, one of their facilities. So let's just pick one, let's say Marriott. And they own the full spectrum with Ritz-Carlton at the top and Residence Inn near the bottom. And imagine if that brand, any one of the ones that you stay at, can get you to join their frequent stayer plan. Well, now you've downloaded their app, you logged in with Facebook, and we're able to go and mine your social sphere. So imagine the first time you go, maybe after the event tomorrow night, for some reason you're going to the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, and you walk into the Eno Wine Bar. One could imagine that because a Bluetooth beacon that's in the wine bar, that Miko, the sommelier, on an iPad will have a rich set of data about you. It could be a curated view into your social sphere. It'll be a look into their CRM system. To put it in perspective, this isn't NDA material. Ritz-Carlton has been storing data on their customers since they opened their doors decades ago. They used to store them on little cards like we had in the libraries, where we go and get the Dewey Decimal System and look up books. And so they've got that long tail data, and they have your transaction data. So imagine you sit down at the wine bar and Miko, the sommelier, all of a sudden knows what you're talking about in your social sphere, what types of spirits and beverages you typically buy at any Marriott property around the world and where you go, and their transaction history as well. So it can really enhance your experience, and you're not touching your phone. You just walked into the wine bar, and because you had that app on your iPhone and that M7 chip is always looking in the background, right? Miko's iPad shows some information about you.
Right. Thanks, mate. So I've got sort of two stories that may help inform, as you were. Thanks, Jeff. I have two stories that may help inform sort of how we think about context, and I hope may sort of interest you and edify you and mildly entertain you at the very most. The first is Factual recently engaged, let's say about 18 months ago, with an app company. It's a very popular app. It's one that probably 3/4 of us in this room have on our phone today. And Factual's proposition was saying, look, there's a massive pain point in that it's very, very difficult for developers to know who their audience is, developers or publishers. And of course, the reason is because Apple and Google have interdicted the consumer in pretty much entirely, but also the architecture of the mobile device. And we said, look, we can help you translate intermittent location into individual profiles about your users. They're anonymous. We don't know who your users are, only you do. But it will help you get a better understanding of when they're not engaging with Yelp, what are they doing? So the interesting thing here was that the main tendency that we found when we spoke to multiple publishers was they wanted homogeneity. They were dealing with a large-scale application where they wanted everybody to have the same identical experience. You know, things like sort of news feeds, which are relatively new and but pretty facile invention, were something that began to break this model where each individual had a different experience. And I raised this within the sort of milieu of this discussion because really that's what context is. It's one very, very important attempt for developers to understand the individual and what's happening around the individual, so the application and the content that's served can be better customized. The other story that I hope will provide at least a little bit more richness around our ensuing conversation today is just how impersonal and unpersonal the internet is. It's fantastic that the internet arrived and all of a sudden we could email people and it was all of a sudden a one-to-one type communication where, you know, those of us growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was all TV and radio, which is a broadcast mechanism, which isn't just a one-way mechanism, but it's one-to-many broadcasting. But the way websites were built, it was really just to address this one-to-many where you had Yahoo and then it talks to everybody. Factual developed a product called GeoPulse Audience, which builds these individual profiles to help give developers an individual context to better understand their users. And I was the product manager, and my biggest mistake on the product was that I overestimated significantly the ability of our partners to work with individual profiles of data. So some people had an audience of 25 million active users, and then we brought them profiles and we said, look, we've now built you sort of contextual information around these 25 million users. Here you go, and it's basically zipped JSON data. And they threw up their hands and said, well, actually, there's nothing we can do with this because we don't have a user data store. All they had was a login mechanism. And this wasn't a single story. We encountered this multiple times. And I certainly erred on the product management side. It was a lesson that was quickly learned, but it's one that I share because it's fascinating in that these very, very large companies that serve millions of users in an app-enabled world, in basically a mobile-enabled world, still don't think conceptually or architecturally about the individual. And fundamentally, that's what the three of us are up here to discuss today, is how we can create that individualized experience.
And I think that's a very key point because, again, I keep going to micro-segmentation, and that's kind of what Tyler is talking about here, is creating a profile for you, which is segmenting you, looking at you, figuring out an interest graph, whatever it may be that you're looking at, but being able to go and figure out what's motivating that individual as opposed to a marketplace. And a lot of the ways that ad networks have been segmenting us is based on things that are just far too coarse-grained. So a lot of what we work on is a more fine-grained understanding of the individual so that we can reduce the noise, reduce the number of WTF moments that are delivered.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that the audience would really like us to kind of cut into is, so we're talking about, so context is important for a better individual experience. What's the true ROI that industries are going to be able to capture if they're able to create this individualization? I mean, where's the sort of the tip of the spear on this?
Well, let's go back to the Ritz-Carlton example, right? So you go in there, and now Miko the sommelier has some reference point on what your interests are in wine and spirits, potentially. And so he's got a good starting point. He thinks of it as upselling you. You think of it as having a more enjoyable experience. So instead of having the $20 glass of wine, you have the $30 glass of wine. You enjoy it more. Marriott made a little more money, and Miko got a better tip. So everybody won out in the transaction, right? And it's about enriching your experience. In this case, sometimes it's about information delivery. So a museum that I recently engaged with, all they wanted to do was eliminate that one little white stick, you know, that you walk around that someone else had up to their sweaty ear a few minutes ago, and you only get to hear those items that they chose to put on there. They wanted to do an app that would do that. And I said, great, but why don't you give them choice? So instead of just having the audio, have a link there that shows that they can go and learn more about the artist, more about the genre, other artists in the genre, and so forth, so that they don't have to figure out exactly what you're thinking at that moment. Yes, you want to hear something about it, but they're giving you a range of choices which potentially is going to reduce or minimize the likelihood of a WTF moment. That one of those links may very well be of interest.
Jeff, can you articulate for us what a WTF moment is?
What the fuck?
And it's on tape.
We know what it stands for, but give us an example of how that goes wrong for the consumer.
So I just looked this up the other day. So I've got a friend who has a contextual app that he keeps putting on his phone because he knows the guys that build it, and he keeps taking it off because he lives on a golf course. So I looked up the other day, 75% of the people in the United States that live on golf courses don't golf. But this ContextAware app keeps delivering him information about golf. Right? That's a WTF moment. It's not relevant to the moment. Or how often have you walked out of the Home Depot, you're getting in your car only to receive that coupon from the Home Depot? Just as you're leaving the location, you've finished your transaction, right? Or you made the purchase online and you keep getting omni-channel advertising. So they're getting omni-channel, right? You made a purchase on the web, but you're done with that purchase cycle and they're still feeding you information.
But is that context or just essentially bad timing? I mean, this has to do with, you know, the device is not sort of sensing things. It doesn't know where it is. I mean, sort of to Tyler's point about location, to a large extent, what is business built on. But you know, doesn't it have a lot more to do with being able to gain that information earlier, so you're able to execute earlier? So it's not just purely about context; it's also about data in advance and good timing.
Oh, without a doubt, right? Context is intertwined. You know, people ask me about Bluetooth beacons, right? And to me, those are entry and exit indicators, right? They serve their purpose. They're a technology. They're a tool in the bag. But we don't know why you're at the Ritz. But when you walk into the wine bar, well, now we've got a little more context, right? But we don't necessarily know who you're with, but we might be able to figure that out. So context is very much interwoven into the fabric of our lives. Like I said earlier, are you there? Are you at the Ritz for a business meeting? Are you there with your wife? Are you just meeting some friends? So what is the context in why you're there? And what might you be interested in differently based on that?
So the way we see context, I think, is a bit of a takeoff from where you guys see it. The return on investment for context has a lot to do with just time. That there's a huge amount of time that people need to get information that is relevant to what they need to do in business. Context is this essentially limiting factor that says, look, you probably don't need to know about this, and this category of data because you're not there. These people aren't involved in this decision-making process. You don't, if you're looking at Michael Smiths, you don't need to know every single Michael Smith in your organization. You probably need to know the Michael Smith that's in your building right now. And these enable people that to get better information more quickly, but it also allows you to get information you probably wouldn't have gotten before because you just wouldn't have taken the time. The reason why this all sort of comes into a wearable context, when we were first building our Google Glass application, we realized you have to take a complete step back in design and product. And my co-founder, Kate Schiessel, who's head of product, really nailed this on the head. How do you live in a world and how do you react in a world where you can't type? And you're not going to talk to your device like you have a conversation going on in your own head. That you need to be able to provide good information reliably and timely. And this has so much to do with broader context. So it's not just about name and place. It's much more about name, place, who else is in this specific space, as well as things like time. All have to be included in the laundry list of information that is about a person or a space that they're in. And we see the return on investment is informing people quickly, informing people easily when they may not have gotten as good of information or may not have gotten information at all.
I'm glad you're taking this into the fourth dimension, Pete.
Time is massively important. Massively important.
So here's something that I find very interesting, and I tend to come back to location. I hope it's not my only everything looks like a nail type hammer. But I think it's a nice counterpoint to the conversations that we're having up here today. We are faced by this dichotomy now in the internet world where it's not just a question of getting enough information. So certainly if you're a developer or you're a publisher, you're trying to just gobble up information about your users so you can adjust how it works, both on the analytics side and on the consumer experience side, make your app much more engaging, do targeting better so you can monetize better. So we're trying to get information. And a lot of companies will actually buy this in from third parties about users. But on the flip side of that, we as consumers are absolutely awash in information that we don't want. And so one of the fundamental advantages of any kind of contextual data, and here I'm sort of refining what we're speaking about as being data, either sort of temporally sensitive data or personally sensitive data that helps developers filter out the dross that exists and surfaces really only the most interesting things. And so on the location side, what you tend to get is this Janus head of experiences. Facing one way, you've got the real time. And this is the old, and I'm not going to say it because everybody talks about it, but it's that sort of, you're outside a certain store and then you get a coupon on your phone and all of a sudden you stop what you're doing and you walk in. It's a very facile example. It doesn't quite work that way. But that example does acknowledge the fact that real-time location, the user is here. How do I change my behavior in the app? How do I serve a more relevant ad? That's hugely valuable. It's valuable to the publishers and advertisers and the consumers. And when you can hit that trifecta, it means that everybody in principle wins. But the other side of the Janus head, looking in the opposite direction, is not the real-time location, it's what we call contextual location. So it's looking back over where users have been over the last several weeks and the several months, and basically wrapping that up, distilling that to say, these users have been here intermittently over time. How can I use that information to actually inform where I think they're going to go next, or both on the anticipatory side, but also as a filtering mechanism? How can I use that data to get rid of some of the stuff that's being thrown at them by other apps or by other experiences? Is anyone in the audience in the advertising side and the ad tech side?
We got a couple.
Couple over there.
A couple lonely folks. Thank you for raising your hand. The reason I point this out is that I personally only got into the ad tech stack world, even though I worked for Yahoo donkeys years ago. But I only got into this relatively recently, and I was extremely surprised because there's a bid standard of basically what kind of data goes back and forth with calls between the exchanges and the DSPs. And it usually talks about either the device and the user. And this fundamental standard that describes the ad and its context has only two locations. Your users are allowed to only have two locations. One is where they live, and the other is where they are right now. So that everywhere in between space is totally, not is it only unknown by developers, but it's not allowed to be known by the actual transport mechanism that the standard describes. And that was another very real awakening to me, is that the business that we are in, the fundamental architecture of the world that we live in right now, has no time for context. And folks like you in the audience and the three of us up on stage are doing our damnedest to hit it over the head and really shoehorn this in to deliver personal experiences.
One of the biggest challenges, so previous to this, I was the director of strategy at a social network called Tag that acquired my last couple of top marks. Problem is in the ad tech space is that context is so close to irrelevant that because the ad tech pipelines just don't accommodate a lot of this data. That they at least from my experience, unless somebody has a contrary experience, they do only say, okay, where do you live? Because this is sort of vetting information. Where are you now? Which is sort of a validating portal to like show me this app. These longer conversations with data tend not to really arise unless you're doing long-term trending. It's not sort of a real-time kind of behavior. At least in my experience. I don't know if you guys have different experiences.
Well, in long-term trending, oftentimes when you look at location history like you were describing, you can begin to understand why the person is there. What I talk about as persona. Because if you look at where they were before they came to this location, all the other times that they went there, you can begin to understand a bit more about what mode they're in. And the closer you can get to, I call it being a chameleon, right? Trying to understand what shade of rose-colored glasses your customer is looking through, and delivering them information that are in a similar shade of rose that's along what they're thinking about it at that time. And we're in the early days. There's no doubt that the WTF moments are going down, but they're still, we're all consumers and we get them, each one of us, on a regular basis.
See, I would argue that the world doesn't even have as many WTF moments as we think they do. I think that inside our own bubble, we think, of course people are going, WTF, what's this plastic thing against my head? But the rest of the world doesn't think of it as WTFs. They actually think of when we give them something better, it's an epiphany. So that we are in this space where people are not expecting this kind of contextual innovation. What they're expecting is the same old, same old. And one of the challenges we face is surprising people in a positive way with context information, whether it be from advertising, whether it be from location-based offers, to just pure location-based search. I would argue that we still are in the epiphany moment as opposed to the pure pain point where somebody walks into a museum and says, I'm having a bad experience, I'm leaving and not paying.
Well, I agree. The bar is very low right now, right? Because we're in very early days. So what we can try and the more noise we eliminate, and that I keep going back to this same thread, it's about delivering something that's relevant, right? And none of us want all this extra noise. But it's still very early days in trying to figure out what that person might want next. And in just delivering, again, I think there's two main areas. Some would disagree with me. One is trying to deliver information, and the other is just trying to enrich an experience. And no, you're not going to walk out of the museum, right? But how many of your friends will you tell about that first time that you had an app that you didn't know they were Bluetooth beacons, but every item for the first time ever in a museum that you wanted to learn about, you could learn about. So I don't disagree with you, but we're beginning to raise the bar.
So, I have a particular opinion about what the killer app is for wearables and context, but which is People Plus. But what do you guys think is the killer application of context for wearables, and particularly wearable and enterprise?
So I think we all probably have a few answers on that.
Yeah.
I'll preface it by the reaction that I want to get is when the user realizes that they have this sort of apotheosis and they realize, oh my God, you mean it doesn't have to be the way that it's been done so long before?
Yeah.
And that sort of, that realization, that change is, I mean, when you've heard that expression, they won't remember what you've said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. You can apply that to your development process as well. And if users are engaged and surprised and delighted by that experience, saying, oh my God, we've been doing it this way for ages, but there is a different way, that's the outcome that we're all looking for.
So, but that's the outcome, but where's the application? Like, if you got $1 million, you got to make one bet, and this is going to be a retirement fund, kid college fund. Where's that bet? That's to you, Tyler.
That's to me, right?
Yeah.
Well, no, I wanted to start with the sort of I guess the broader target that you could hit without trying to guess the future.
Can we go for low-hanging fruit first?
Maybe.
Jeff, do you want to go for low-hanging fruit? Like maybe I can compose an answer.
I'll give a simple example. So we're trying to figure out when a worker at this one company changes their context, because these group of workers are all union, and they've figured out how to slow their day down so that it can be a more enjoyable experience for them. And they drive around the facility in golf carts. Used to be mopeds, but the union got them up to golf carts. And it's 2 miles often, 2 to 3 miles from, about 2 miles from where they're working to where their office is. They have to go back and get their next job order. So an app is being developed that is going to understand when their context shifts, as in they've finished that project, and they'll be delivered their next work order to a mobile device, and they won't have to go and drive that 2 miles in and 2 miles back anymore. So there we're looking for a context shift, just so we can deliver them to the next work order.
Thank you for giving me some time to think, Jeff. So the part of the not umbrage, but the issue that I take with your question is that it makes us begin to think all towards a single experience or a single device, and this is the magic thing, right? Mm-hmm. And really, my take is a little bit more amorphous on what that experience is going to be, because it's going to be connected, right? Now that we're moving with wearables, we're moving out of that siloed application world that's owned by Google and Apple, which means that we have better, as developers, we have better control over our devices, what they expose, what they share. We can give more control to the individual rather than the large company. And so what we're going to begin to see is actually an interconnectivity. And if I were to put my finger on the one thing I'd like to see, it's that kind of interconnectivity between multiple devices, not just as a transport mechanism of Bluetooth, not just as proximity sensors like BLE. Fundamentally, what I hope to be able to see is an environment, is a development-oriented, hardware, software, cloud-based world where information about an individual under his or her control is exchanged between devices to enrich the experience amongst them all. And I think so many of us have this mobile phone world in our view where it's an app and that app is siloed, that once we divorce ourselves from that, we'll realize just how much potential there is to have a much more subtle and contextually driven mobile experience.
And I actually completely agree with you, because I think that the huge opportunity in the space is not, there's a lot of people building some great stuff. Sunny from Shine was upstairs. We have a huge number of device manufacturers building the hardware. However, I think that the big opportunity, because there's going to be a lot of winners, but there's going to be a lot of losers in that space. The true winners are going to be the people that build that back-end infrastructure. The shovels for the gold miners. We all know the story about California. The guys who got rich were the guys who were selling bread, selling pans, selling shovels. And from the People Plus standpoint, we want to be essentially the human information behind wearable technology. So that's where our $1 million bet is in that space of providing that contextual human object data to allow people to understand companies and people much better in that mobile wearable space, because whether it's a piece of Google Glass, whether it's an iPhone, whether it's even your computer, because computers are becoming far more aware of their context now, not just simply by IP address, but there's so much more information that they're becoming smarter about, that they're going to become essentially a wearable mobile device very, very soon. I think that I agree with you completely that that's where the bet should be if you're going to be doing a company, and that's why we're making a bet with People Plus.
So I agree completely with what you guys are saying, but I'll share with you how I look at it, because I look at it a little differently. So I think about the future world we're going to live in that we call ambient intelligence, where the world around you has a sense of what you might want next. And whether it be your home, at the Ritz, at a Marriott, at Disney, wherever. And a precursor to ambient intelligence, I believe, is contextual intelligence, because that's what's going to feed the ambient intelligence environments. And that's what I think all of us are working on, is building the foundation for a world that has contextual intelligence about all of us here, right, individually. And in each of our own ways, on our own vectors, our own paths, we're foraging, we're looking for the truffles. We have each different ways that we go about doing it. Some of it's low-hanging fruit, some of it a lot of work, a lot of learning, big learning curves. But the bottom line is that I couldn't agree more that the business that we're in is the picks and shovels business. And helping to lay that foundation, the cornerstones of a contextually intelligent world. And I view it as being 5 to 7 years from now, it's going to be pretty remarkable looking back on this second GLAZED event. And I think we will have come quite a ways.
We have a few minutes left in the session now before the three of us conclude, and we can wrap up saying a couple words on that we can send everybody upstairs with. But we'd be keen to hear from the audience if there's any questions that you'd like to ask. Yes, please.
One of the perhaps elephants in the room kind of concerns me is privacy and also cross-platform sharing of data. If you're in an enterprise environment, you value your data and your client informatics, and probably the reason I go back to that hotel is because Joe the bartender does know that I happen to like a certain brand of champagne. And I probably don't really want to have my competitor know what I spend, what I do. So there's two issues. The one is this really a focused enterprise type of a contextual data, because it seems there are some challenges on the other. And then just in an overview in a shared world, it seems very invasive. And this is sort of things that nobody seems to want to talk about. Who owns the data?
Well, so thank you very much for asking that question. It's absolutely critical. I hope we haven't given the impression that we're sidestepping delicately around that, because I think it's absolutely central to the conversations that we're having. And context is not a technological challenge alone. There's huge implications about data ownership, personal privacy, engaging with brands and businesses. It's sort of it's a panel all by itself, of course. So I think it's important enough that we each take a moment to answer your points and your questions specifically.
So I think that privacy, the freaky line, as Robert Scoble likes to call it, is different for every individual and in many different settings for that individual. And my perspective is that when you develop trust, so you're talking about you trust that bartender, you trust that hospitality company. And so you're willing to make that Faustian trade of your data for an enrichment of your experience. So I tell my clients when we do a pilot project, not to hide it. Find out what are the freaky lines for your customers so that we know if we're going to go, when we go to roll this out, where to dial back, right? So you can do it in behind the scenes, or you can let people know about it. But that, to me, it's about building trust. And if you build trust with your customers, then that freaky line moves closer to being an outlier. But many companies are going, we all know this, I mean, we're all consumers here too, so there's lots of third-party data that can be purchased. You know, and Google just lost their lawsuit in the EU about being able to be forgotten, right? Which is a really interesting concept. So context is just about how we analyze the data. It's not about the fundamental question that you're asking, you know, but I'll tell you that, you know, you look at the big data companies and they think it's their data about you. But that's a totally different topic.
So the way I sort of see, you know, privacy and context is we're actually going to be taking back. You know, there's an argument that we essentially lost the privacy war and none of us knew it. Like there was a battle being fought, we weren't even participants, and all of a sudden we woke up and we were on the wrong side of the enemy lines. What's happening now is that every single piece of computational information that you create about yourself, whether it's your mobile phone, your wearable device, or even your computer, needs to be able to talk to the outside world in order to sort of do what it does. Google needs to, you know, you need to connect to the internet. What's going to be happening in the near future, and the way, you know, way context has become more powerful, is you're no longer going to have to talk to the outside world. There are ways that this entire room can actually talk to itself and each other in private, interesting, and secure ways, communicate key data because of the context, and still be able to maintain your privacy. Just because we get to hand less data back and forth because we're moving away from a brute force world. The way People Plus looks at it, we are providing basic infrastructure for that information, but we're not really providing this to the outside world. We're allowing individuals and individual organizations to be able to better manage themselves internally. But we're not saying, oh, hey, you know, wholesale private data, credit card information, we need everything you've got in order to make our system work. That's a brute force world. That's big data. I would argue that the world is changing, that little data is going to start usurping big data because we can do more with less outreach to the world. So I think that we're at the very precipice of a brave new opportunity having to do with little data, devices, wearable and otherwise, and your privacy, all benefiting the user for both experience as well as data security.
And I think that's, I'm going to steal your words in the future, this little data, because I hadn't heard of that before. But when we talk about curating context, as you're saying that, I'm saying to myself, that's about taking big data and turning it into little data. And that's what we try and do at ContextM, is turn that big data into little data. So I like your visual.
You already have.
I wanted to know what happened when the clock on stage reads 0, and I think we've all just seen the light turns red and it flashes a big middle finger to the 3 speakers, tells us to get off.
That's okay.
So if I could, on behalf of my fellow panelists, if I could thank you very much for taking your after lunchtime to join us here today. Certainly we've enjoyed it, and we'd enjoy catching up with you afterwards if at all possible. So thanks again for your time, everyone.
Cheers, thank you.